In the summer of 1954, a team of British intelligence officers sat down to review a classified report that made several of them visibly uncomfortable. The report concerned a Greek shipping magnate named Aristotle Onassis. It documented in careful detail how he had spent the previous 3 years acquiring classified technical specifications for British whale factory ships, vessels whose engineering represented decades of proprietary development by some of Britain's most sophisticated naval architects, and had used those specifications to build his own fleet of whalers in Hamburg shipyards, without paying a penny in licensing fees, without seeking permission, and without the slightest apparent concern that what he was doing might have consequences. It also documented how he had negotiated a secret agreement with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia to carry Saudi oil exclusively on his tankers, a deal that, if it had succeeded, would have given a single private individual control over a significant portion of the global oil supply. The Americans had discovered the agreement and intervened, forcing its cancellation. The British were still processing the audacity of it. The intelligence officers were not reading about a criminal. They were reading about a man who operated in the space between what was technically legal and what established powers were willing to tolerate, a space he had been navigating with extraordinary skill since he was a teenage refugee with no money, no connections, and no country. Aristotle Onassis died in 1975 as one of the wealthiest private individuals in the world. His fortune, estimated at the time of his death at somewhere between $1 and $500 million, the uncertainty itself reflecting how effectively he had hidden the full extent of it, had been built from nothing, not from modest beginnings, not from a struggling family with some assets, from nothing, from a city burning around him, from a boat carrying refugees across the Aegean, from a teenage boy who arrived in a foreign country with the clothes on his back and a set of instincts about power and opportunity that would prove to be, across 5 decades, essentially infallible. He became the most famous private ship owner in history. He married the widow of an American president. He owned an island. He built a tanker fleet that was, at its peak, larger than the navies of most countries. He outmaneuvered the British Empire, Standard Oil, and the Saudi royal family, sometimes simultaneously. And it started, as the most extraordinary stories often do, with complete catastrophe. Smyrna, Ottoman Empire, January 1922. The city is one of the most cosmopolitan ports in the Eastern Mediterranean, a place where Greek, Turkish, Armenian, Jewish, and Levantine communities have lived in proximity for centuries, trading, arguing, intermarrying, and conducting the commercial business of the Eastern Aegean with a sophistication that most European capitals of the era could not match. Aristotle Socrates Onassis was born here on January 20, 1906, to Socrates Onassis, a prosperous Greek tobacco merchant, and his wife Penelope. The family was comfortable, not aristocratic, not fabulously wealthy, but solidly established in the commercial middle class of Smyrna's Greek community. Socrates Onassis had built his tobacco business over years of patient commercial work, developing relationships with suppliers, buyers, and the network of agents and intermediaries that Mediterranean trade required. Young Aristotle grew up in this environment of commerce. His earliest memories, as he later described them in interviews and in the fragmentary autobiographical material he occasionally shared with journalists, were of the sounds and smells of the port. The ships at anchor in the harbor, the cries of traders in the covered bazaars, the particular atmosphere of a city that existed primarily as a node in a network of exchange. He was not a notably academic child. He was, however, from a very young age, intensely interested in how people made deals, how goods moved from one place to another, and why some people profited from that movement while others did not. The world he grew up in ended in September 1922. The Greek-Turkish War, which had been building since 1919 when Greek forces landed at Smyrna under the terms of the post-World War I settlements, collapsed in the summer of 1922. The Turkish nationalist forces under Mustafa Kemal, later Ataturk, routed the Greek army in a campaign of devastating efficiency. As the Turkish army approached Smyrna in September 1922, what followed was one of the worst atrocities of the early 20th century. The Great Fire of Smyrna burned from September 13th to September 17th, 1922. The Greek and Armenian quarters of the city were systematically destroyed. Estimates of the death toll range from 10,000 to 100,000, the uncertainty itself reflecting the chaos and the deliberate absence of documentation by those responsible. The survivors, numbering in the hundreds of thousands, crowded onto the waterfront, wading into the harbor in some cases to escape the flames, while Allied warships, British, French, American, Italian, sat at anchor in the harbor and largely did not intervene. Aristotle Onassis was 16 years old. He watched his city burn. His father, Socrates, was arrested by Turkish authorities. The family's assets, the tobacco business, the property, the accumulated commercial relationships of a lifetime were effectively confiscated or destroyed in the chaos. Aristotle managed to navigate the bureaucratic nightmare of the occupation with a combination of charm, linguistic ability. He spoke Greek, Turkish, and French, and a precocious understanding of what specific officials needed to be told or given in order to obtain specific outcomes. He secured his father's release. He helped organize the family's departure. He did things that a 16-year-old boy, by any normal expectation, should not have been capable of doing. And he did them not through luck, but through a systematic application of intelligence to the question of what each person he needed something from would respond to. The family eventually reached Greece. They were refugees, part of the approximately 1.5 million Greeks displaced from Anatolia in the population exchanges that followed the war. Greece in 1922 was struggling to absorb this enormous influx of displaced people, and the welcome was limited. The family had almost nothing. Aristotle Onassis made a decision. He would not stay in Greece and build slowly from the ruins of what his family had lost. He would go somewhere else entirely, somewhere without a history of who he had been and what he had lost, and build from zero on his own terms. In 1923, at the age of 17, he boarded a boat for Buenos Aires, Argentina. He had $200. He knew nobody in South America. He spoke no Spanish. He was, by every conventional measure, starting from nothing. What he had, which the conventional measures did not capture, was something considerably more useful than money or connections or language. He had watched everything he knew be destroyed in a single week. He had navigated a military occupation as a teenager and gotten what he needed from people who had every reason to give him nothing. He had seen at the most visceral possible level that the world did not operate according to rules of fairness or merit or institutional order, that it operated according to power, leverage, and the willingness to act decisively when others hesitated. He was 17 years old, and he already understood things that most people spend their entire lives avoiding the knowledge of. Buenos Aires, 1923. Argentina in the early 1920s was one of the most dynamic economies in the world, a country of enormous agricultural wealth, rapidly expanding urban infrastructure, and a commercial culture that rewarded the entrepreneurial and the resourceful in ways that more established economies did not. It was also a country with a large and established Greek immigrant community, which meant that Aristotle Onassis, arriving with $200 and no Spanish, was not entirely without social resources. The Greek diaspora networks of the early 20th century were remarkably effective mutual aid systems, communities of people who understood displacement and who had developed practical mechanisms for helping new arrivals find their footing. Onassis found work within weeks of arriving. His first job was as a telephone operator for the British-owned United River Plate Telephone Company, a position that paid modestly, but that had an advantage that Onassis recognized immediately. It required him to learn Spanish, and it placed him in daily contact with the business community of Buenos Aires, the names and voices and concerns of the city's commercial life flowing through him for 8 hours a day. He treated the telephone operator job as an education. He listened to conversations with the focused attention he had developed watching his father conduct business in Smyrna. He learned not just Spanish, but the specific vocabulary of Argentine commerce, the terms, the references, the names that mattered, the relationships between companies and individuals that structured the city's economic life. By the time he had been in Buenos Aires for a year, he knew more about who was doing business with whom in the city than many people who had been there for decades. He also began, almost immediately, trading on his own account. His first commercial venture in Argentina was in tobacco, the business he had watched his father build in Smyrna, and the business whose destruction he had witnessed firsthand. He understood tobacco. He understood the networks through which it moved, the quality differentials that created pricing opportunities, the relationships between buyers and sellers that could be exploited by someone who understood both sides. He began importing Greek tobacco into Argentina. The volumes were small at first. He was operating with minimal capital, building the business transaction by transaction, reinvesting every profit rather than spending it. He worked hours that his colleagues at the telephone company found incomprehensible. The day job during the day, the trading operation in the evenings and on weekends, the reading and the planning and the constant mental activity of someone who was not in Argentina to have a comfortable life but to build something specific. By 1925, he had saved enough to quit the telephone company and focus entirely on his trading business. By 1927, he had established himself as a serious participant in the Argentine tobacco import market, with connections to Greek suppliers, established relationships with Argentine buyers, and a growing reputation for reliability and commercial intelligence. In 1929, he was appointed Greek consul in Buenos Aires. He was 23 years old. The appointment was, in the context of the Greek diplomatic service of the era, more commercially than politically significant. The consul's role in a major trading city was partly ceremonial and partly practical, facilitating commercial relationships between Greek businesses and the local market. But it gave Onassis something more valuable than the official duties. It gave him access. The consular position opened doors in Argentine business and government circles that a tobacco trader, however successful, could not easily open on his own. He used those doors with characteristic thoroughness. He attended every diplomatic and commercial function the position required him to attend, and many it did not, building a network of relationships across the Argentine establishment that would prove useful in ways he could not entirely predict. But by the early 1930s, Onassis was already looking beyond tobacco. The tobacco business had given him capital. It had given him commercial experience and the discipline of building something from nothing through patient, systematic work. But it was, fundamentally, a commodity business, a business where the margins were constrained by competition, where the product was interchangeable, where the barriers to entry were low enough that any well-capitalized competitor could replicate what he had built. He wanted something different. He wanted a business where the barriers to entry were structural, where the capital requirements were so large, or the expertise so specialized, or the regulatory environment so complex that competitors could not simply decide to compete and immediately do so. He wanted a business where scale itself was a competitive advantage, where getting bigger made you stronger in ways that being big in tobacco never could. He had been watching the shipping industry. In 1932, the global shipping market was in one of the worst depressions in its history. The Great Depression had collapsed world trade. Ships that had been worth hundreds of thousands of dollars were sitting idle in harbors across the world, their owners unable to find cargo to carry, their banks desperate to recover any value from assets that were hemorrhaging value by the month. A Canadian-built freighter that had cost $400,000 to build in 1920 could be purchased in 1932 for $20,000, sometimes less. Onassis bought 6 of them. He was 26 years old. He spent virtually his entire accumulated capital, the savings of 9 years of relentless commercial activity in Buenos Aires, on 6 second-hand cargo ships that most serious shipping people considered overpriced even at depression prices. His friends thought he had lost his mind. The ships were old. The market was catastrophically depressed. There was no obvious near-term reason to believe that global trade would recover in any time frame that made the investment sensible. Onassis had a different analysis. He was not buying ships to operate in the current market. He was buying ships because he believed, correctly as it turned out, that the depression was temporary, that world trade would eventually recover, and that the person who owned ships when the recovery came would be positioned to profit from it in ways that the person who waited until the recovery was obvious would not. This was the first demonstration of what would become the central pattern of his commercial life: buying when everyone else was selling, at prices that reflected maximum fear rather than realistic long-term value, and having the patience and the nerve to hold through the period of maximum uncertainty. It was also the first time he did something that he would do repeatedly across the next 4 decades. He borrowed heavily to amplify the bet. The 6 ships were not purchased entirely with his own capital. He used his savings as a deposit and borrowed the remainder, taking on leverage that, if the shipping market had continued to decline rather than recovering, would have wiped him out completely. The shipping market recovered. Onassis was positioned, and he was just getting started. By the mid-1930s, Aristotle Onassis had established himself as a serious figure in the international shipping industry. His 6 Depression-era freighters had been profitable, the profits had been reinvested into more ships, and the Onassis fleet was growing at a pace that attracted attention from the established Greek shipping families who dominated the industry. Those families, the Niarchos clan, the Livanos family, the Goulandries dynasty, represented generations of accumulated maritime expertise and capital. They had built their fleets over decades, developing relationships with shipyards, charterers, banks, and insurance underwriters that gave them structural advantages over newcomers. They regarded Onassis with a mixture of respect for his commercial energy and condescension toward his origins. He was a refugee from Smyrna, self-made, without the family history and social connections that the established Greek shipping aristocracy considered essential credentials. Onassis regarded the established families with a mixture of genuine respect for what they had built and a cold-eyed assessment of where their thinking was wrong. And on one critical strategic question, he believed they were profoundly wrong. The question was oil. The global petroleum industry in the 1930s was undergoing a transformation that most of the shipping industry had not fully processed. The major oil companies, Standard Oil, Royal Dutch Shell, British Petroleum, had for decades operated their own dedicated tanker fleets, carrying oil from production fields to refineries to distribution points in vessels they owned and controlled. The independent tanker market, ships owned by third parties and chartered to carry oil cargoes on a voyage-by-voyage or time charter basis, was relatively small and somewhat marginal in the overall petroleum transportation system. Onassis believed this was about to change. His analysis, which he developed through extensive research and through conversations with oil industry contacts he had cultivated in Argentina and in his growing network of European business relationships, was that the oil companies were about to face a fundamental problem. Demand for their product was growing faster than their ability to build and operate dedicated tanker capacity. The capital requirements of maintaining large modern tanker fleets were substantial, and the oil companies' managements were increasingly reluctant to tie up that capital in ships when the same capital could be deployed in exploration, refining, and distribution infrastructure. If the oil companies were going to reduce their own tanker capacity and rely increasingly on independent charters, then the person who owned the most independent tanker capacity, the most modern, the most efficient, the largest ships, would be positioned to capture an enormous share of an enormous and growing market. Onassis began building tankers, not buying second-hand vessels this time, building them. He placed orders with shipyards in Sweden and Germany for vessels that were, by the standards of the mid-1930s, large. Then he began thinking about whether they were large enough. The economics of tanker shipping have a fundamental characteristic that Onassis understood and exploited more aggressively than any of his contemporaries. Scale economies are dramatic and consistent. A tanker twice as large as another tanker does not cost twice as much to build, does not require twice as many crew members, does not consume twice as much fuel, and does not require twice as much port time to load and discharge, but it carries twice the cargo. The per-unit cost of transporting oil drops sharply as ship size increases, meaning that the owner of very large ships has a structural cost advantage over the owner of smaller ships that cannot be overcome by any operational efficiency. Most of the shipping industry knew this in principle. Few had acted on it as aggressively as the logic demanded, partly because very large ships required very large capital outlays, partly because the port infrastructure of the 1930s was not designed for vessels above certain sizes, and partly because the established wisdom of the industry, passed down through generations of experienced operators, suggested that flexibility and diversification were safer than concentration in very large specialized assets. Onassis did not have generations of established wisdom to constrain his thinking. He had a spreadsheet and a willingness to follow the logic wherever it led. He ordered larger ships, then larger again. By the early 1940s, he had committed to vessels that were significantly bigger than the industry norm, ships that the major oil companies initially regarded with skepticism because their size exceeded the capacity of some of the ports they would need to use. The Second World War interrupted everything. Onassis, who had been living primarily in Europe through the late 1930s as his business grew, spent the war years in the United States, in New York, and in Los Angeles, where he had developed a social life that reflected his growing wealth and his taste for company at the highest levels of money and celebrity. He was a regular at the best restaurants, the best parties, the kind of social environments where the merely successful mixed with the genuinely powerful. He also, during this period, began a relationship that would last 23 years, his marriage to Athena Livanos, daughter of Stavros Livanos, one of the most powerful figures in the Greek shipping aristocracy. The marriage in 1946 connected Onassis to the very establishment he had been building towards since his days as a telephone operator in Buenos Aires. It also, not coincidentally, gave him access to the Livanos family's banking relationships, business intelligence, and the social networks of the Greek maritime world. His new brother-in-law was Stavros Niarchos, who had married the other Livanos' daughter and who was, in almost every dimension, Onassis's most significant rival. The Onassis-Niarchos rivalry would define Greek shipping for the next 3 decades, a competition between two men of roughly similar origins, roughly similar methods, and diametrically opposed personal styles that drove both of them to heights of ambition and risk that neither might have reached alone. But before the rivalry could fully develop, Onassis had a more immediate opportunity to exploit. The war had ended, the global economy was recovering, and the oil tanker market was exactly what he had predicted it would be: enormous, growing, and hungry for capacity that the independent operators could provide. He returned to Europe to collect his ships and begin building his empire. What he found when he got there would require a different kind of audacity than anything he had attempted before. In 1947, Aristotle Onassis traveled to Hamburg, Germany. Germany in 1947 was a country under Allied occupation, divided into zones controlled by the Americans, British, French, and Soviets, its industrial infrastructure shattered by 6 years of war and 2 years of Allied bombing campaigns, its population struggling with food shortages, displaced persons, and the psychological processing of total military defeat. The Hamburg shipyards, which had been among the most productive in the world before the war, were damaged but not destroyed, and the skilled workforce, the engineers, the naval architects, the welders and fitters and machinists who represented generations of accumulated shipbuilding expertise, was still largely present, desperately in need of work. Onassis had come to Hamburg for a specific purpose. He wanted to build whaling ships. The post-war whale oil market was, in 1947, genuinely lucrative. Whale oil was used in margarine, soap, lubricants, and a range of industrial applications. The global supply of whale oil had been severely disrupted by the war. Most of the major whaling fleets had been requisitioned for military service or lost to enemy action, and the demand, particularly from a European continent desperate for fats of any kind after years of rationing, was intense. The problem was technology. Effective modern whaling required factory ships, large vessels equipped with processing facilities that could convert caught whales into oil and other products at sea, without needing to return to port between catches. The factory ship technology that made modern industrial whaling economically viable had been developed primarily by British companies, and the specific engineering details, the slipway design that allowed caught whales to be hauled onto the ship's deck, the processing equipment, the refrigeration systems, were proprietary, developed and refined over decades of operational experience. Britain controlled this technology, protected it as a commercial asset, and had no intention of sharing it with a Greek shipping magnate who wanted to build a competing whaling operation. Onassis obtained the specifications anyway. The exact method by which he acquired the technical details of British whale factory ship design has been the subject of considerable historical discussion and some deliberate obscurity on Onassis's part. What is documented is the outcome. Onassis's Hamburg-built factory ships incorporated engineering features that closely replicated proprietary British designs, and the British whaling industry was furious about it. The British government's Board of Trade investigated. The intelligence services took an interest. Diplomatic complaints were filed. Onassis acknowledged nothing, admitted nothing, and continued building his whaling fleet. The method appears to have involved a combination of approaches that were characteristic of his general operating style. He hired engineers and technical consultants who had worked in or around the British whaling industry and who possessed, in their professional knowledge and their memories, detailed understanding of the design principles involved. He obtained technical documentation through intermediaries whose specific roles were never clearly established in any official record. And he employed naval architects in Hamburg, who were skilled enough to translate general design principles into specific engineering drawings without requiring complete original blueprints. Whether this constituted industrial espionage in any legally actionable sense was a question that the British government eventually decided not to pursue to a definitive conclusion, partly because the evidentiary trail was sufficiently unclear, and partly because Onassis's legal team made it plain that any formal proceedings would be expensive, prolonged, and uncertain in outcome. The whaling fleet that emerged from the Hamburg shipyards was operationally effective. Onassis named his factory ship the Olympic Challenger and began whaling operations in the Antarctic in 1950. The operation was profitable from its first season, but the whaling venture, significant as it was commercially, was almost immediately overshadowed by something far more audacious, something that went beyond merely appropriating British technology to attempting to restructure the global oil market itself. In 1952, Aristotle Onassis began secret negotiations with the Saudi Arabian government. The context requires explanation. Saudi Arabia had, in 1950, renegotiated its oil concession agreement with the Arabian-American oil company, Aramco, on a 50-50 profit-sharing basis. The Saudis were now receiving half of the oil revenues generated from their territory, which represented an enormous improvement over the previous arrangement. But the Saudis had no control over the transportation of their oil. Aramco and the major oil companies that were its shareholders, Standard Oil of New Jersey, Standard Oil of California, Texaco, and the other members of what was sometimes called the Seven Sisters, controlled the tanker fleets that moved Saudi crude to world markets. Onassis proposed a different arrangement. He would establish a tanker company, the Saudi Arabian Maritime Tankers Company, in which the Saudi government would hold a significant stake. This company would have the exclusive right to transport all Saudi oil exports. Onassis would provide the ships and the operational expertise. The Saudis would provide the cargo, guaranteed, captive, protected from competition by the terms of the agreement. If it had worked, Onassis would have had a legal monopoly on the transportation of Saudi oil, one of the largest and most rapidly growing oil flows in the world. The major oil companies, which had spent decades building their position in the Middle East, would have found a crucial element of their supply chain suddenly controlled by a single Greek shipowner who answered to no government and owed loyalty to no cartel. The agreement was signed by King Saud in January 1954. The reaction from the oil companies was swift, coordinated, and overwhelming. Standard Oil and its partners immediately informed the Saudi government that the Onassis agreement violated the terms of the Aramco concession, which gave the oil companies exclusive rights over transportation as well as production. They threatened to withdraw from Saudi Arabia entirely. They engaged the United States State Department, which made clear to the Saudis that the American government's support for the Saudi regime, significant given the Cold War context and the strategic importance of Saudi oil to Western energy security, was conditional on the Aramco relationship being maintained. The Saudis cancelled the agreement. Onassis received a cash settlement, reportedly around $1 million, that compensated him for his costs and his trouble without acknowledging that he had done anything wrong. He had tried to capture the Saudi oil transport market and failed, but the attempt itself, the audacity of it, the near success of it, the way it had demonstrated that the structure of the global oil market was not immutable, had established his reputation in a way that no conventional business success could have. Aristotle Onassis was 48 years old, one of the most famous businessmen in the world, a man who had built a tanker fleet from nothing, pirated British technology, and very nearly rearranged the global oil trade. And the most dramatic chapters of his story were still ahead. The failure of the Saudi deal did not slow Aristotle Onassis. It clarified him. The lesson he drew from the Saudi episode was not that he had overreached. It was that he had been operating in territory where the major oil companies and the American government had interests sufficiently large to mobilize against him. The solution was not to be less ambitious, it was to be more independent. To build a position so large and so essential to the functioning of the global petroleum market that even the oil companies and the American government would find confrontation with him more costly than accommodation. He returned to building tankers. In the mid-1950s, Onassis made the decision that would transform him from a large shipowner into something qualitatively different. He ordered supertankers, vessels of a size that had never been built before, ships so large that the engineering challenges of constructing and operating them were genuinely novel. His competitors in the Greek shipping community, including his brother-in-law Stavros Niarchos, were also ordering large tankers. The race between Onassis and Niarchos to build the world's largest ships had become personal, obsessive, and from the perspective of both men's bankers, somewhat alarming. In 1954, Onassis ordered the construction of the Tina Onassis, named for his wife Athena, known as Tina, a tanker of approximately 45,000 deadweight tons. It was, at the time of its launch, the largest tanker in the world. Within 2 years, Niarchos had ordered something bigger. Onassis responded by ordering something bigger still. Each escalation in scale required larger financing, larger shipyards, larger crews, and more sophisticated operational arrangements. Each escalation also increased the cost advantage that very large ships had over smaller ones, widening the gap between the major independent operators and anyone who might attempt to enter the market with conventionally sized vessels. By the late 1950s, the Onassis fleet included tankers of over 80,000 deadweight tons, vessels that dwarfed anything the major oil companies operated in their own fleets. The oil companies, which had initially regarded the independent supertanker owners with competitive hostility, had begun a process of quiet accommodation, negotiating long-term charter agreements with Onassis and Niarchos that gave the Greeks guaranteed revenue streams in exchange for the guaranteed availability of the tanker capacity that the oil companies needed but no longer wanted to own themselves. This was exactly the outcome Onassis had anticipated when he began building tankers in the 1930s. The oil companies had outsourced their transportation problem to him. He was now essential infrastructure for the global petroleum market, a position that was, in practice, almost impossible to displace because building the ships to replace him would take years and cost billions. The Suez Crisis of 1956 accelerated everything. When Egypt's President Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal in July 1956, and the subsequent military intervention by Britain, France, and Israel closed the canal to shipping, the entire global tanker market was transformed overnight. Ships that had been traveling from the Persian Gulf to Europe through the Suez Canal, a journey of approximately 6,000 miles, now had to travel around the Cape of Good Hope, a journey of approximately 11,000 miles. The demand for tanker capacity, measured in ton-miles rather than simply in tons, increased by roughly 40% instantaneously. Onassis had more tanker capacity than almost anyone else in the independent market. The crisis that humiliated Britain destabilized the Middle East and accelerated the end of European colonialism was for Aristotle Onassis a financial windfall of extraordinary proportions. Charter rates for large tankers tripled during the crisis period. His fleet was fully employed at rates that generated returns on the capital he had invested in a matter of months. He reinvested the profits into more ships, larger ships. The cycle that had begun with 6 Depression-era freighters purchased for $20,000 each was now operating at a scale where individual vessel orders were worth tens of millions of dollars, and the total fleet represented a capital investment that exceeded the GDP of several small countries. His personal life during this period reflected the wealth in ways that were deliberately, calculatedly public. He had purchased the Christina O, a Canadian frigate that he had converted, at enormous expense, into what was generally acknowledged to be the most luxurious private yacht in the world. The Christina's fittings were genuinely extraordinary. Whale foreskin bar stools, Venetian glass mosaics, a swimming pool whose bottom could be raised to create a dance floor, a collection of art that included pieces by El Greco, Renoir, and Picasso. The guest lists for cruises on the Christina read like a catalogue of mid-century power. Winston Churchill, who spent several extended periods on the yacht in his old age, Greta Garbo, King Farouk of Egypt, various presidents, prime ministers, and members of European royal families. The yacht was not simply a pleasure vessel. It was a business tool, a floating environment that Onassis controlled completely, in which his guests were comfortable, obligated, and available for conversations that, in the normal course of their public lives, would have been impossible to arrange. The Christina created a space outside normal institutional settings where the people who mattered in the mid-century world could be encountered, known, and cultivated. Onassis understood, at a level that most businessmen do not reach, that the most valuable commodity in international commerce is not capital or ships or technical expertise, it is access. And access, at the highest levels, requires environments in which the people who hold power feel genuinely comfortable rather than being professionally entertained. The Christina was the most effective access creation mechanism in the world, and Onassis was its host, its owner, and its most determined beneficiary. No account of Aristotle Onassis is complete without understanding Stavros Niarchos, the man who was simultaneously his closest rival, his brother-in-law, and the person who drove him to levels of ambition and risk that he might not have reached in the absence of direct personal competition. Stavros Niarchos was born in 1909, 3 years after Onassis, into a Greek family with some existing involvement in the grain trade. He was educated at the University of Athens, served in the Greek Navy during the Second World War, and entered the shipping business in the early 1940s with capital inherited from his grandfather. His background was, in almost every respect, more conventional than Onassis's. He had not been a refugee, had not built from nothing, had not spent years as a telephone operator and tobacco trader in South America. What he shared with Onassis was a vision of the tanker market's potential, the willingness to use massive leverage to act on that vision, and a competitive temperament that turned commercial rivalry into something personal and consuming. The two men first became related by marriage in 1947, when Niarchos married Eugenia Livanos, the elder daughter of Stavros Livanos. Onassis married the younger daughter, Athena, in 1946. This arrangement, which brought two of the most aggressive figures in Greek shipping into a single extended family, was the source of considerable social awkwardness and enormous competitive energy. The Onassis-Niarchos rivalry operated across multiple dimensions simultaneously. There was the direct commercial competition, each man ordering larger ships than the other, each attempting to secure better charter relationships with the major oil companies, each trying to be the first to exploit new routes, new cargo types, new market opportunities. There was the social competition, each maintaining the most spectacular yacht, the most glamorous guest lists, the most widely reported social life among the international wealthy of the 1950s and 1960s, and there was the deeper, more psychological dimension. Two men who had both built their fortunes through ruthlessness and intelligence, who understood each other's methods with uncomfortable clarity, who were each aware that the other was watching and calculating and looking for advantage. The competition over supertanker size became almost absurd in its escalation. When Onassis ordered the Tina Onassis at 45,000 tons, Niarchos ordered the World Glory at a similar size and attempted to claim primacy. When Onassis ordered larger, Niarchos responded. By the early 1960s, both men were commissioning vessels in the 100,000-ton range, ships that required entirely new port facilities to accommodate and entirely new operational procedures to handle safely. The financial institutions that funded both men, primarily American and European banks, along with various government export credit agencies, occasionally expressed concern about the pace of fleet expansion and the leverage ratios involved. Both Onassis and Niarchos managed these concerns through a combination of demonstrated profitability, the political relationships they had cultivated, and the simple fact that by the time any particular vessel was delivered, the charter arrangements were typically already in place, making the cash flows that would service the debt relatively predictable. The personal dimensions of the rivalry became genuinely tragic in the 1960s. Niarchos and Eugenia Livanos had a troubled marriage. By multiple accounts, Niarchos was a difficult and sometimes violent husband. Eugenia died in 1970 under circumstances that were officially ruled as a drug overdose, but that generated a police investigation and persistent public suspicion about the circumstances of her death. Niarchos was cleared of any wrongdoing. The investigation, however, and the public attention it generated, damaged his reputation in ways that the commercial competition never had. Onassis and Tina had divorced in 1960, in circumstances that involved Onassis's by then open relationship with the opera singer Maria Callas. Tina subsequently married Niarchos, her former sister-in-law's widower, in 1971. She died the following year, in 1974, also officially of a drug overdose, also under circumstances that generated investigation and suspicion. The same family, the same pattern, the same absence of definitive answers. The rivalry between Onassis and Niarchos ended, effectively, with Onassis's health collapse in the early 1970s. By that point, Niarchos had built a fleet that was, by some measures, slightly larger than Onassis's. The two men had spent 30 years driving each other to build more, risk more, and accumulate more than either would have done in the absence of the other. The world's tanker fleet and the global petroleum market's infrastructure was substantially shaped by their competition. Whether Niarchos or Onassis won the competition is a question that neither man would have considered particularly meaningful. They were not playing a game with clear rules and a defined endpoint. They were building empires, in real time, against the only opponent either of them fully respected. In the spring of 1957, at a dinner party in Venice, Aristotle Onassis met Maria Callas. Maria Callas was, at that moment, the most famous opera singer in the world, a soprano whose combination of technical mastery, dramatic intensity, and personal charisma had transformed the opera world in the late 1940s and 1950s. She had a voice that critics described in language normally reserved for natural phenomena, not merely beautiful but overwhelming, capable of expressing emotional states that other singers could only suggest. She was also, by 1957, a woman of considerable personal complexity, married to her manager Giovanni Battista Meneghini, a man 27 years her senior, who had built her career with genuine dedication and whom she was beginning to find confining in ways she could not entirely articulate. Onassis was 51, Callas was 33. Their introduction by the socialite Elsa Maxwell was the beginning of one of the most documented, most discussed, and most consequential personal relationships of the mid-20th century. The relationship did not become public immediately. For 2 years, while Onassis remained married to Tina and Callas to Meneghini, they conducted what was, by the standards of their respective social circles, a relatively discreet, which is to say only moderately public, mutual fascination. Both were invited frequently to the same events. Both were guests on the Christina on multiple occasions, in company that included various other prominent figures. The crisis came in the summer of 1959, when Callas and Meneghini joined a Christina cruise that also included Winston Churchill, Onassis's childhood friend Nikos Konialides, and various other guests. Over the course of 3 weeks at sea, the relationship between Onassis and Callas became unmistakable to everyone on the yacht. Meneghini confronted the situation. Onassis acknowledged it. The cruise ended with the beginning of a scandal that dominated the European and American press for months. Tina Onassis filed for divorce in New York in 1960, citing adultery. She received a settlement that included a cash payment, the New York apartment, and custody of the couple's 2 children, Alexander and Christina. Meneghini and Callas separated the same year. By 1960, Onassis and Callas were openly together, one of the most photographed couples in the world, present at every significant social event in Europe and America, a combination of beauty, wealth, fame, and power that the gossip press of the early 1960s found inexhaustible. The Onassis-Callas relationship was, by all accounts, genuinely passionate and genuinely destructive in approximately equal measure. Onassis was not a faithful partner. He had never been in any of his relationships, and Callas, who had sacrificed the possibility of children and a conventional life for her career, and then for her relationship with Onassis, found the infidelities painful in ways that his previous partners had perhaps been better equipped to absorb. He was also, in ways that the public relationship obscured, gradually withdrawing from her, or rather, becoming interested in someone else. Onassis had met Jacqueline Kennedy. The meeting had occurred in 1963, before the assassination of President Kennedy in November of that year. Onassis was part of the extended social world of the Kennedy family, connected through various mutual acquaintances, through his friendship with the Kennedy patriarch, Joseph Kennedy, through the general overlap between the international wealthy and the American political aristocracy that characterized the Kennedy years. After the assassination, Jackie Kennedy became one of the most famous women in the world, a figure of extraordinary public fascination, simultaneously a symbol of national grief and an emblem of a particular kind of American elegance that the Kennedy years had briefly made available as a national self-image. She was also practically a widow with 2 young children, a generous Secret Service detail, and the public profile that made any attempt at private life extraordinarily difficult. Onassis offered her a solution, or rather, an alternative. The Christina and Scorpios, the private Greek island he had purchased in 1963, represented environments where normal public life simply did not apply. The island could be secured. The yacht could be anchored offshore. The paparazzi could be kept at a distance, sufficient to make genuine privacy possible, in a way that it was not in New York or Washington. In October 1968, Aristotle Onassis and Jacqueline Kennedy were married on Scorpios. He was 62. She was 39. The reaction was immediate and global. In the United States, the marriage was received with a mixture of shock, disapproval, and the specific kind of public bewilderment that accompanies events that don't fit established narrative categories. Jackie Kennedy was a national icon, a figure whose identity had become, in the 5 years since Dallas, inseparable from American grief, American grace, and a particular story about what the country had briefly been and lost. That she had married a twice-divorced Greek shipping magnate, 23 years her senior, a man known for ruthlessness, infidelity, and a relationship with legality that was at best flexible, was not what the American public had expected. The Greek press was more straightforwardly hostile. The Orthodox Church expressed formal disapproval. The Athens newspaper Estia ran the headline, "Aris, why did you do it?" A question that captured a genuine public sentiment in Greece that Onassis, a national figure whose rags-to-riches story had made him a source of genuine Greek pride, had diminished himself by marrying an American widow for reasons that were assumed to be primarily social rather than romantic. Maria Callas, who had not been warned of the marriage before it was publicly announced, received the news in Paris. Her response, in the interviews she gave in the weeks following, was measured in public and devastating in private. She had given him, by her own account, everything: her career, her health, the possibility of children, years of her life. The marriage to Jackie Kennedy was, for Callas, not merely personal betrayal. It was the revelation that she had been, throughout, a temporary arrangement rather than a permanent choice. The Onassis-Kennedy marriage was not, by any neutral assessment, a happy one. It was functional, practical, and occasionally public in ways that served both parties' interests. Jackie gained security and genuine protection from intrusive public attention. Onassis gained the ultimate social validation, the companionship of the most famous woman in the world. But the warmth and intensity that had characterized the Onassis-Callas relationship was absent. Both parties understood, clearly enough, that they had made a transaction rather than a romance. The tragedy that was coming had nothing to do with the marriage. On January 23, 1973, Alexander Onassis crashed a Piaggio seaplane at the Athens airport. Alexander was 24 years old, the elder of Onassis's 2 children with Tina, a young man who had grown up in the impossible shadow of his father's fame and wealth and dominating personality. His relationship with Aristotle was, by most accounts, one of the most painful in both their lives. Onassis had been a largely absent father during Alexander's childhood, present for the important public occasions, absent for most of the day-to-day reality of a child's life, and when present, overwhelmingly demanding in ways that left little room for the kind of unconditional acceptance that children need, and that Onassis, shaped by his own catastrophic displacement from normal family life at 16, may not have known how to provide. Alexander had, in the years before the accident, been working in the Onassis business, learning the shipping operation from the inside, taking on increasing responsibility, attempting to demonstrate to his father that he was capable and serious. Their relationship had improved somewhat in the early 1970s, moving from the strained distance of Alexander's adolescence towards something more collegial. Alexander was engaged to be married. He had a life that was, by any normal measure, beginning. The seaplane crash was severe. Alexander sustained massive head injuries. He was placed on life support in the Athens hospital. The world's best neurosurgeons were flown in. Onassis used his connections and his wealth with the focused desperation of a man who understood that money could buy almost everything and was discovering the specific things it could not. The surgeons were unanimous. Alexander's brain damage was irreversible. He would not recover. The life support was maintaining a biological process, not a person. Onassis refused to accept this for 36 hours. He sat by his son's bed, he made calls, he summoned more doctors. He offered, by multiple accounts, sums of money so large that they were effectively meaningless as offers, because no amount of money could change the neurological reality that three separate teams of specialists had independently assessed and reported. On January 25, 1973, the life support was turned off. Alexander Onassis died. He was 24 years old. The effect on Aristotle Onassis was total and immediate. People who knew him well and who saw him in the weeks and months following Alexander's death described a man who had been fundamentally altered, not simply grief-stricken in the way that death produces grief, but broken in a more structural sense, as if the loss had removed something load-bearing from the architecture of his will to continue. He had built everything for reasons that he had never fully articulated, but that had always included at some level the idea of continuation, the building of something that would outlast him, that would pass to his children, that would give the story of a refugee boy from Smyrna a legacy proportionate to what he had survived and created. With Alexander dead and Christina, his daughter, whose relationship with her father was no less complicated than Alexander's had been, as the sole remaining heir, the future of what he had built felt different. He also began to suffer from a physical condition, myasthenia gravis, a neuromuscular disease that causes progressive muscle weakness that his doctors had been monitoring for some time and that the stress of Alexander's death accelerated significantly. His eyelids drooped. He wore tape to keep them open for business meetings. He lost weight. The physical vitality that had been one of his most striking characteristics, the energy, the presence, the sense of someone who occupied more space than his actual physical size, began to diminish. His marriage to Jackie Kennedy effectively ended, in any meaningful sense, in the period following Alexander's death. They remained legally married, but Onassis had begun divorce proceedings by early 1975, proceedings that his death would render moot. Jackie Kennedy, for her part, had spent the years of the marriage in New York, living a life that was, with the exception of the public status conferred by the marriage, largely independent. The companionship that the marriage had been intended to provide had not materialized in the way either party had expected. Onassis also, in this final period, engaged in what appears to have been a genuine attempt to reconnect with Maria Callas. They met in Paris, where Callas had been living in increasing isolation. Her voice had effectively failed by the early 1970s, the product of years of overwork and the physical consequences of her dramatic weight loss in the late 1950s. And without her voice, she had lost the identity that had defined her since childhood. They were two aging people who had lost the things that had given them their sense of themselves, finding in each other the only person who fully understood what had been lost. Callas died in September 1977, 2 years after Onassis. The official cause was cardiac arrest. She was 53 years old. She had spent the last years of her life in her Paris apartment, largely withdrawn from public life, declining invitations and interviews, waiting, by most accounts, for nothing in particular. Onassis died on March 15, 1975, in the American hospital in Paris. The immediate cause was bronchial pneumonia. He was 69 years old. Aristotle Onassis left behind an estate whose value was, and remains, genuinely difficult to establish with precision. The deliberate opacity that had characterized his financial arrangements throughout his life, the offshore holding companies, the Liechtenstein foundations, the Panama-registered vessels, the complex web of corporate structures that separated legal ownership from beneficial control in ways that even sophisticated investigators found difficult to fully map, meant that the total value of what he had built was not easily calculable from the outside. His daughter Christina inherited control of the Onassis business interests. She was 24 years old at the time of her father's death, already the survivor of a life that had included her parents' divorce, her mother's marriage to her father's rival, her brother's death, and the particular isolation of growing up as the child of someone so comprehensively famous that normal human relationships were structurally difficult. Christina had the intelligence and, when she chose to apply it, the commercial instincts of her father. She did not have his emotional resilience. She managed the Onassis business interests for 14 years, navigating the tanker market through the difficult years of the 1970s oil crisis and its aftermath when overcapacity and declining charter rates made the shipping industry painful for everyone. She married 4 times. She had one daughter, Athena, born in 1985. Christina Onassis died in November 1988 at the age of 37 of pulmonary edema. Her death, like so much in the Onassis family story, came with circumstances that were officially explained and privately questioned. She had struggled with weight, with depression, with the specific kind of purposelessness that afflicts people who have inherited enormous wealth without the formative experiences that give wealth meaning. Athena Onassis, the granddaughter of Aristotle, became at the age of 3 the heir to one of the largest private fortunes in Europe. Her guardianship was the subject of prolonged legal battles between the Onassis Foundation, which had been established to manage the family's philanthropic and business interests, and her father, Thierry Roussel, a French businessman whom Christina had married in her final years. The Onassis Foundation, the Alexander S. Onassis Public Benefit Foundation, established in memory of Alexander, became the primary institutional expression of the Onassis legacy in the decades following Aristotle's death. The foundation funds cultural programs, scholarships, academic institutions, and artistic endeavors, primarily in Greece and in the international Greek diaspora. It operates the Onassis Cultural Center in Athens, funds the Onassis Prize, and maintains a significant presence in Greek cultural life. The shipping business itself went through the transformations that the global tanker market required through the late 20th century. The era of individual shipping magnates building personal fleets of supertankers on the Onassis model did not outlast the oil crises of the 1970s, which produced exactly the kind of overcapacity crisis that massive simultaneous investment by multiple operators tends to generate. The industry consolidated, professionalized, and lost much of the romantic individualism that had characterized the Onassis era. What remains of Aristotle Onassis, beyond the foundation and the shipping interests, and the biography that has been written and rewritten many times in many languages, is something harder to categorize. He was, in the most direct sense, a demonstration of what is possible when someone who has lost everything operates without the psychological constraints that the fear of loss imposes on people who still have something to protect. The refugee boy who arrived in Buenos Aires in 1923 with $200 had already experienced the worst. His city had burned. His family had been stripped of everything. He had navigated a military occupation as a teenager. He knew at a cellular level that the worst could happen and that he could survive it. This knowledge, this specific experiential freedom from the fear of catastrophic loss, gave him a risk tolerance that his competitors, who had built from stability rather than from rubble, could not match. He could take the bet on 6 Depression-era freighters because he had already lost more than those ships were worth and had survived. He could attempt the Saudi oil deal because the worst outcome, failure, embarrassment, financial loss, was something he had already lived through on a scale that dwarfed the specific risk. He could order supertankers that his bankers found alarming because the alignment between his analysis of the market and his willingness to act on that analysis was not constrained by the psychological need to protect an established position. He was also, in ways that his admirers are sometimes reluctant to fully acknowledge, a man of considerable moral flexibility. The acquisition of British whaling technology through whatever means he used was not straightforwardly ethical. His treatment of Maria Callas, the years of a relationship that was central to her life and peripheral to his, ending in a marriage to someone else that he did not warn her was coming, was not kind. His business practices in various contexts operated in the territory between the legally permitted and the genuinely fair in ways that favored the legally permitted without particular concern for the genuinely fair. He was a man of his time and of his origins, shaped by a world in which the established order had demonstrated, clearly and personally, that it would not protect him, and in which the alternative to ruthlessness was not gentleness but simply failure. The moral framework that allows people raised in stable societies to operate according to principles of fair dealing and institutional respect is at least partly a luxury of stability. Onassis had not had that stability. He had built his own stability from scratch, and the methods that building required were not the methods that stability, once achieved, would have sanctioned. Whether the man who built all of this was admirable or merely extraordinary is a judgment that depends on what you think extraordinary people are for. He created thousands of jobs. He built institutions that continue to fund culture and education. He demonstrated that the barriers that separate the dispossessed from the powerful are not as absolute as the powerful prefer to suggest. He was also ruthless, unfaithful, and willing to operate at the edges of legality when the opportunity was sufficiently attractive. He was, in other words, a human being of exceptional capability operating in an exceptional context. And the full picture of what he built and how he built it is more interesting and more instructive than either the hagiography or the condemnation. The boy who ran from the burning city of Smyrna, with nothing but his instincts intact, died in a Paris hospital as one of the most famous private individuals of the 20th century, with a fleet of ships larger than many navies, an island in the Ionian Sea, a foundation bearing his son's name, and a place in the history of global commerce that no amount of subsequent complexity can erase. He had bet everything, repeatedly, on his own analysis of what the world was about to need. He had been right often enough that the bets that went wrong, the Saudi deal, the whaling controversies, the personal catastrophes, were footnotes to a record of commercial achievement that remains, decades later, genuinely extraordinary. From rubble to empire, from a refugee boat crossing the Aegean to the most famous yacht in the world, from $200 and no Spanish to the cover of every major magazine on earth. That is the Onassis story. And it starts, as all the great ones do, with someone who had absolutely nothing left to lose. So we've traced the full arc from the burning waterfront of Smyrna in 1922 to a hospital room in Paris in 1975. From a 17-year-old refugee with $200 to a man whose wealth, at its peak, was so large and so deliberately hidden that nobody has ever fully calculated it. The Onassis story is not, in the end, primarily a story about shipping or oil or the mechanics of building a business empire in the mid-20th century. It is a story about what displacement does to a person and what a person can do with displacement. What most accounts of Onassis miss is the connection between the catastrophe of 1922 and the extraordinary risk tolerance that defined his commercial life. He was not naturally reckless. He was not a gambler in the psychological sense. He was not chasing the rush of the bet or the pleasure of the game. He was a man who had already experienced the worst possible outcome and who therefore had a relationship with risk that was qualitatively different from anyone who had not. When he bought 6 Depression-era freighters with virtually everything he had, he was not being courageous in the conventional sense. He was being rational. Rational according to a calculus that incorporated the knowledge, earned through personal experience, that catastrophic loss was survivable, and that the only thing that definitely didn't work was not trying. The fear of losing everything that paralyzes most people did not paralyze him, because he had already lost everything and was still there. The modern relevance of the Onassis story is not the specific business strategies. The tanker market has changed beyond recognition. The whale oil industry has effectively ceased to exist. The Saudi Arabia of 1954 is as remote from the present as ancient history in terms of its geopolitical structure. What remains relevant is the underlying pattern. Identify structural changes in a market before they are visible to the consensus. Position yourself to benefit from those changes through leverage and scale, and have the psychological resilience to hold through the period of maximum uncertainty between your analysis and the market's eventual agreement with it. This pattern is not specific to shipping. It is the pattern of every transformative business built in conditions of genuine uncertainty. The willingness to act on an analysis that the consensus has not yet reached before the evidence is overwhelming is the thing that separates people who build empires from people who observe other people building them. Onassis had one other quality that the business school literature on entrepreneurship tends to underemphasize. He genuinely enjoyed it, not the wealth, though he clearly enjoyed that too, but the game itself. The deal-making, the negotiation, the cultivation of relationships, the constant calculation of advantage and disadvantage. He was a man who had found the specific activity that his specific combination of intelligence, temperament, and experience made him uniquely capable of, and he pursued it with the total commitment of someone who has no separation between work and identity. When that identity was disrupted by Alexander's death, by the myasthenia gravis, by the slow withdrawal of the energy that had driven everything, the collapse was rapid. He had built himself into his work so completely that the work's difficulties became his own in a way that was ultimately not survivable. Whether Aristotle Onassis was a good man is a question that the evidence does not resolve cleanly in either direction. Whether he was a great one, in the specific amoral sense that history uses the word great, meaning consequential, meaning transformative, meaning someone who bent the arc of events in ways that would not have occurred in his absence, is considerably less ambiguous. He was a refugee who arrived with nothing and remade himself entirely into one of the most powerful private individuals of the 20th century. He pirated British technology, challenged Standard Oil, very nearly captured the Saudi oil transport market, built the world's largest private fleet, and along the way became one of the most famous human beings on Earth. He did all of this without a college degree, without inherited wealth, without government support, and without the kind of stable institutional backing that the established order provides to people it recognizes as its own. What he had instead was the memory of a burning city, a boat across the Aegean, and the specific freedom of someone who has already lost everything once and is therefore genuinely free to try for everything again.